Hey, were you able to attend Nelson Mandela's funeral this week? No, I wasn't either, nor did all those dead people that Nelson and Winnie Mandela had a hand in killing. I'm John Leffler. The program is Steel on Steel.
Steel on Steel. News, commentary, interview, and debate. An alternative information source for politics, religion, and global events. Now, here's the host of Steel on Steel, John Leffler.
All right, let's do some difficult things here on today's program. Welcome to Steel on Steel. We're a weekly program dedicated to the sharpening of ideas, news, commentary, interview, information, and debate, much of which you will not hear elsewhere. Our goal and pledge for the last 24 years that we've been on the air has been to be an early warning service to connect seemingly unrelated dots in the area of economics, politics, and religion, project seemingly unrelated trends, and show you where those dots and trends are actually always coming together right over the horizon where normally the herd doesn't see it. Herd's almost always running in the wrong direction, believing the latest political correctness. Mainline media, they're looking in the rearview mirror trying to tell us where we're going or trying to determine social outcomes by reporting some stories and not reporting others, reporting some facts and not reporting others. Since all of that's true, and we try to give you a much more complete picture of what's going on, truth, veritas being the core issue. Is it true? How do you know that? And if so, so what? Since all of that's true, your failure to be informed does not make me a wacko. Looking at all of the flags at half-mast this week in honor of the passing of Nelson Mandela and his funeral services, which were held this week, I thought to myself, I haven't done anything on South Africa in a long time. And do we let the mythos ride that is floating around about Nelson Mandela, or do we talk about the other side of the whole issue? Evil rides in on the back of a white horse. Segregation in this country was a gross evil. Apartheid in South Africa was a gross evil. The whole apartheid system in South Africa turned on the 1950 Population Registration Act that purported to define different races as the basis for then segregating them in what was possibly every walk of life. The problem with gross evils, even being perpetrated by somewhat good societies, is that quite frequently a worse evil rides in on the back of a white horse purporting to fight it. And in the 1980s, the African National Congress launched a violent campaign of township murders of political enemies led by teenagers and even children that actually helped set the path for the generation we see in South Africa today, responsible for the sky-high murder rates across South Africa. So let's talk about the Nelson Mandela myth. Why is Mandela so revered? We hear that he was the archetype of a freedom fighter, standing for rights and human dignity, the man most known for ending apartheid. If you type the words South Africa peaceful transition into Google, about 1 million hits or better appear. But nothing could be further from the truth, because that is simply not how the transition in South Africa actually happened. You know, even Pope Francesco said in his tribute to Nelson Mandela, quote, paying tribute to the steadfast commitment shown by Nelson Mandela in promoting the human dignity of all the nation's citizens and in forging a new South Africa built on firm foundations of non-violence, reconciliation, and truth, I pray that the late President's example will inspire generations of South Africans to put justice and the common good at the forefront of their political aspirations. What has happened is that the Western media have spun a myth to satisfy the needs of Western mythology, but the reality is somewhat different. Mandela began as a terrorist. He is not a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi. He advocated violence from the start. Between 1985 and 1996, deaths from political violence in South Africa exceeded 20 to 30,000 people, with a large number taking place in the KwaZulu-Natal area. These were largely blacks murdering blacks in campaigns of intimidation led by Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. Remember that Mandela, even though he was in jail for part of his time, had fierce loyalty to the ANC and to the alliance that it had with the South African Communist Party, and to people he saw as key supporters of its cause. This included Soviet Russia, Muammar Gaddafi, Khomeini in Iran, and Fidel Castro and other such luminaries. At his trial in 1964, he spoke in his own defense and explained why he had chosen to organize an underground army and plan a campaign of violence directed toward the end of overthrowing the apartheid regime. And this caused a split, even in Amnesty International, with one faction advocating continuing to work unconditionally for Mandela's release, the other saying, but he advocated violence and that violated Amnesty International's own policies, and so he could not be called a prisoner of conscience. So they came up with a split compromise within the organization. During his trial, there was a 62-page document in Mandela's own handwriting, which was used as evidence against him, entitled, How to Be a Good Communist. Here's what he said, quote, in our own country, the struggles of the oppressed people are guided by the South African Communist Party and inspired by its policies. The aim of the South African Communist Party is to defeat the nationalist government and to free the people of South Africa from the evils of racial discrimination and exploitation, and to build a classless and socialist society in which the land, the mines, the mills, etc. will be nationalized. Under a Communist Party government, South Africa will be a land of milk and honey. There will be enough land and houses for all. There will be no unemployment, starvation, and disease. The victory of socialism in the USSR, in the People's Republic of China, in Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, where the living conditions of the people were in many respects similar and even worse than ours, proves that we too can achieve this important goal. He goes on to say, we Communist Party members are the most advanced revolutionaries in modern history and are the contemporary fighting and driving force in changing society and the world. So the question is, was Nelson Mandela a communist? He always denied that. But he was an advocate of democratic socialism. However, some of the things that were introduced at his trial, which I bet you haven't seen in the local media following his death, really point out the fact that if he wasn't a communist, he surely believed what it was the communists believed. He insisted that the future of humanity cannot be surrendered to the so-called free market with government denied the right to intervene. Strangely enough, this sounds just like Pope Francesco's recent papal encyclical, Evangelii Gaudium, where he said much the same thing. Mandela also declared the need for ownership and management of the South African economy to reflect the racial composition of our society, and he criticized the capitalist system in South Africa for elevating to the highest pedestal the promotion of the material interests of the white minority. Now that's a whole mix of ideas that are going on right there. It's one thing to talk about opportunity under capitalism and another to blame the capitalism itself as being the cause of that. So the real question is, was Nelson Mandela a communist? Who were his friends? And then where are we today? Did those promises that he was making back in the 1980s ever come true for South Africa today? You know, you have to recognize that the principle of deceit is an essential, indispensable segment of the dialectical process that global communists and world socialists just simply love to use. You can't tell people what the end game is because they wouldn't buy it if they understood it. You can only promise them a bright future while concealing your true motives. And as the program goes on for the first part of the show today, I think we're going to discover that that is precisely what has happened in the case of South Africa. We're at steelon.steel.com. I'm John Lufter. The program is Steel on Steel. More words from Nelson Mandela. In South Africa, a Communist Party member must take part in the mass struggle initiated by the South African Communist Party, the Congress movement, the African National Congress is what he was talking about there, by the way, or other political bodies within the liberation movement. The people of South Africa, led by the South African Communist Party, will destroy capitalist society and build in its place socialism. The transition from capitalism to socialism and the liberation of the working class cannot be effected by slow changes or by reforms, as reactionaries and liberals often advise, but by revolution. One must therefore be a revolutionary and not a reformist. In another article by Nelson Mandela entitled Operation Mayabuya, Mandela wrote, as in Cuba, the general uprising must be sparked off by organized and well-prepared guerrilla operations, during the course of which the masses must be drawn in and armed. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lufter here with you. The question is, was Nelson Mandela actually a communist? Did he achieve the reforms he promised? And are the people of South Africa, white, black, and coloreds, all better off today than they were back then? In essence, is the Western myth about Nelson Mandela actually true? Nelson Mandela denied the fact that he was a communist, but I've just been reading some quotes from things that he wrote or spoke. According to the South African Communist Party, he was, the website says, in a tribute to a true revolutionary. At his arrest in August of 1962, the website says, Nelson Mandela was not only a member of the then underground South African Communist Party, but was also a member of our party's Central Committee. To us as South African communists, Comrade Mandela shall forever symbolize the monumental contribution of the South African Communist Party in our liberation struggle. In the book Mandela, the authorized biography, author Anthony Sampson says Mandela started out as an anti-communist, but was impressed by the Communist Manifesto. He was struck by the Soviet Union's support for liberation movements throughout the world and by the relentless logic of dialectical materialism, which he felt sweeping away the superstitions and inherited beliefs of his childhood. One of those beliefs, according to Sampson, is Christianity. He says that Mandela experienced some pangs at abandoning his Christian beliefs that had fortified his childhood. In the 2010 book, Young Mandela, The Revolutionary Years, author David James Smith describes Mandela being present at a secret meeting of the Communist Party in December of 1960, when it decided to begin its own armed struggle 6 months before Nelson Mandela even raised the subject with the African National Congress. In 1961, he continued. The South African Communist Party was still accepting funds from Moscow, using the Johannesburg travel agent as a conduit for the money. Even if he never became a communist, his long-term relationship with them is undeniable. Then there is the case of his wife, Winnie Mandela. Nelson was in jail when a lot of Winnie's shenanigans went on with the African National Congress. She was still married to Nelson Mandela at the time he became president in May of 1994 in South Africa. The couple had separated 2 years earlier, however. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission found Ms. Willie Madikizela Mandela politically and morally accountable for the gross violations of human rights, concluding that she had personally been responsible for the murder, torture, abduction, and assault of numerous men, women, and children, as well as indirectly responsible for an even larger number of such crimes. The favorite tactic of the African National Congress was that of necklacing. Now, in case this is new to you, the victim who was to be terrorized, remember the goal of terror is to terrorize the population, would have his hands bound and tied, would have a tire placed around his neck, and then the tire would be soaked in gasoline or in other kinds of inflammable hydrocarbons and set alight. And the victim would burn to death in a very horrid way as the tire itself melted into the victim's skin, not to mention the burning being caused by the gasoline. Was Mrs. Mandela involved with this? She gave a speech on the 13th of April in 1986 where she endorsed the practice of necklacing. She said, quote, "With our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we shall liberate this country," end quote. Many of the moderate blacks were saying, we don't want communism in South Africa, but we do need to abolish apartheid. However, once the campaign of terror launched by Mandela's African National Congress began burning blacks alive, remember the majority of violence was blacks against blacks in this area, the moderate groups simply disappeared from view, joined the radical side, or were burned alive for their belief system. So was Nelson Mandela different? Apartheid had to go, and it went. The question is, would it have gone with or without Nelson Mandela? In going back to Don McIlvaney's intelligence advisor from 1990 and also quoting another one from 1987, it's amazing how